See, now it just feels like my upper lip is too big. Who gives a shit, though, really? 2, 3, 4. Beep, boop, ba, ba, beep, da. Yeah, ba, beep, ba, blah, blah, blah. For. Like, I didn't want to even. I wish I hadn't alluded to it. It would have been funnier if I had just shut my app. Well, me and Funny parted ways a long time ago, so that's why I'm doing this instead. All right. So, okay, yeah, we'll go this order. First up, I read. This is last week. What a dum dum. I held up the sign for picks of the week. Why didn't you just sit there in your corner? All right. First up this week, Blood Syndicate #1, or rather, Blood Syndicate Season 1 #1. And I think I've mentioned this before, and I should really just dig it up and figure it out. But this whole idea of seasons is obviously. Oh, I need to make a sign for the opening tangent. So back in the early 2000s, I remember talking to a guy that I knew who was in the industry, and we were talking about this, how that was at the time when comic book creators and publishers especially started making monthly books more for the trade paperbacks. And also, it's weird to think now, but in the early 2000s was when television was finally being taken seriously. Television had been ubiquitous my entire life, and my parents' entire life, for that matter. But really, when you think about it, it hadn't been around for that long. And it was always dismissed as just crap. And even when I was a kid, I knew that wasn't entirely true, but it's mostly true. And since television was much more popular than comic books were, and this was before the MCU, there was a real push, I think, to make comic books more like television, superhero comics especially. And in the early 2000s was when you would get the previously on synopsis at the beginning of any issue. It was always more like late 90s that started cropping up, but it seemed to really take hold in the early 2000s. And I don't really care. I mean, the problem I have with it to this day is that it's really kind of ruined the splash title page as a tradition thing. I'm already getting off the tangent. So this idea of seasons. Eventually, since Image Comics led the way with this in the independent scene, the idea of a monthly comic book has, been dying out for years now. And even like diehards like myself, I don't know, I can't speak for everybody, but I think of them less being monthly and more weekly because I get new ones every week. But obviously, they don't put out the same title every week. Well, sometimes they do. But yeah, so since these independent creators, largely for Image, but also Dark Horse, etc., they weren't chained to that anymore because they weren't working for Marvel or DC, who were still very, to this day, very monthly schedule. And so they would do an arc and then take a break and then come back and do the next arc. And that's kind of how just things go. Kaiju Max was the first book that I can remember, at least the first book that I remember giving a poop about, that made it like it was not volume 1, it was season 1. And that was one of the real issues to me. It was seasons are for television, volumes are for books, etc. But it doesn't. Like I say, Xander Cannon, who did Kaiju Max not that long ago, maybe a year or two ago, had a whole editorial in the back of his book about why he uses that, and it convinced me. But now I don't remember why exactly. This is all to say that the notion of seasons for comic books is stupid. A season is a measurement of time, not a measurement of length. And I know people, that's the thing about even with television, does the new fall season matter to anybody anymore? I haven't watched television in at least 5 years, and probably even since before that. where I lived before at my mom's house, we had a DVR, so I never had to be home for anything. And even before that, I used to just tape everything that I wanted to watch so I could fast forward through the commercials. It's just a dumb thing. But the good news is Blood Syndicate is back. When Milestone came back, so DC Comics back in 1992, I want to say it was, maybe earlier, started an imprint called Milestone Comics, which was by, for, and about African American creators and superheroes. And I loved it back then, especially because in the early 90s, I wanted nothing more than to be a part of the black community. And then they brought them all back with a lot of the same creators, although not on this one. But not a lot of them, but like Reginald Hudlin came back, I believe, Dennis Cowan, a lot of guys who worked on. So they brought Static, and they brought Icon, and they brought Hardware, which is my personal favorite. But my other favorite was Blood Syndicate. And it's been like a year now that they've been doing these, and I was like, where is Blood Syndicate? Alphabetically, it should be first. And to be frank with you, I don't remember anything about this book. I just remember liking it because it was a team book. It was the only team book I think they had. And so now it's back, and I'm excited. It's written by Jeffrey Thorne, whose name I know, but I couldn't tell you why. Drawn by Chris Cross, which is a dumb name, but he's a good artist. Or she, I guess I shouldn't. But yeah. Blood Syndicate Season 1. I'm looking forward to them being renewed. Fridays on ABC. Also, we got Hulk versus Thor, Banner of War, Part 1. This is Alpha, because we don't do 0 issues anymore. We're on the Greek letters. And what more do I really need to say? It is the 60th anniversary of both of these characters. This year is a lot of anniversaries. 1962 was a very, very big year for Marvel Comics. So, yeah, Hulk, Thor, let me look at my calendar here. 50 years of Ghost Rider. That's obviously not the 60s, is it? 50 years of Luke Cage. Some of these are done. 60 years of Spider-Man. Yeah. So, yeah. This is a big year for Marvel Comics and for a lot of their banner characters. Donny Cates is writing this, which is really good news because not only is Donny Cates a very good writer, he's also writing both Hulk and Thor currently. So it makes sense to have him fight. And yeah, I don't need to say anything more about that. This one, on the other hand, this is 8 Billion Genies #1 by the great Charles Soule and the also great Ryan Brown. This was another Image book. I have one of each. So Soule and Brown a few years ago did one of my favorite comics called Curse Words, which was a story about a wizard from another dimension who came to Earth and became like this kind of godly type, people worship. He's like a superhero, but he was really kind of a dickhead. And it was really, really good. Soule and Brown both have a real knack for that sort of thing. Funny without being cute. Yeah. Ryan Brown did a book called God Hates Astronauts that I really liked. I think I talked about not too long ago. Charles Soule writes a ton of stuff that I love. He is the guy who killed Wolverine, which is a rare thing for anyone to say, even in superhero comics. He's currently writing 1 or 2 Star Wars titles, although I think he's writing the main Star Wars title and Darth Vader. I could be 100% wrong on that. I think Charles Soule started out as a novelist, and he still writes a novel every now and again. But yeah, it was I want to say about 8 or 10 years ago that I started seeing his name around more and being like, man, this guy's really good. He wrote Wolverine. He's written a lot of Star Wars. He wrote that Poe Dameron series, which was highly underrated, even by me at the time. The basic of this is very similar to Curse Words, wherein everyone on Earth overnight is all of a sudden given a genie and one wish. So you can imagine the sort of chaos that's going to come from that. So it's in a very similar vein as Curse Words, although I'm loath to say it's the same thing. It's magical. It's probably going to be dark and funny at the same time. And I'm into it. Those are picks of the week. And now the things I almost showed you first, like it matters. Yeah. Okie dokie. Let me get a little organized here. And that will go there. And this will go there. Thank you very much. All right, so first up was Dogs of London by Peter Milligan and Artesita, which is apparently Brazilian for good artist type. No, Artesita, in his native language, which I'm assuming is Portuguese, means anyone who mistreats or kills art. It's a very punk name to have. So yeah, this was, I think when I said last, I didn't know anything about this. This is a very good British mafia story, which again, underrated. The works of Guy Ritchie aside, I don't think this sort of thing has really been given much credence, I guess. You think organized crime stories, you think the Italians is like the first thing. The British are probably way down the list, but yeah, you got all those Guy Ritchie movies, including ones like Layer Cake, which he was only a producer on. Get Carter, like Michael Caine stuff in the 70s. I mean, there's some really, really good hard-boiled crime coming out of England. Always has been. It's beginning to go into kind of a supernatural-ish. It takes place largely in the 60s, but by the end of this issue, we see our characters in the present, and things start to get weird. So I'm looking forward to it. It's Milligan. I don't need to say anything else. This was also really good. Spider-Man 2099 Exodus. I also didn't realize I had gotten 2 books written by Steve Orlando this week, but it's just kind of a coincidence. This was great. It was honestly though, it was weird reading a Spider-Man 2099 book by someone other than Peter David. Peter David tends to get, I wouldn't say cutesy, but his dialogue definitely gets cuter. A lot of banter. And Orlando is not without that. Ghost Rider 2099 makes an appearance. I don't know, it was a very simple, very action-packed story. I was all on board. I think that's what's going on here. It was a lot of really fun action, but I didn't really remember what the hell the story was. Ah, yes. Okay. I gotcha. There's in the far-flung future of Nueva York, there is a shadowy organization known as the Cabal, and I'm pretty sure that's from the 90s. Like that was something that's not something that they're making up for this series. And Miguel is trying to find out who's behind it all, because what they're doing in this story is they are giving memberships to people who can, kill enough guys or something like that. So he's out to stop this sort of senseless violence with more senseless violence. It never fails. And so by the end of the issue, we find out who's in head of the Cabal, and boy, does it raise some questions. So that'll be fun. I'm really enjoying that. This was so good. Giant Size X-Men #1, Thunderbird, or Thunderbird #1. Co-written by Steve Orlando, who's also writing the Marauders. Co-written with some sort of wrestler, Nyla Rose. I haven't paid attention to professional wrestling. Well, not when I was in the late 80s, early 90s was my era for wrestling. And I will never say a cross word about professional wrestling. It is a fine art form as far as low art forms go. It's one of the best, but it is also kind of one of those things, not dissimilar to comics for some people, that I just kind of grew out of a little bit. I don't like that phrase. I never have. I've never liked the labeled mature readers on books like stroke books. That notion has always bothered me, and I think I want to hold on to that, because to grow out of something implies that it's not good. Here one thing that I can say for sure two things I can say for sure that I grew out of the films Fight Club and The Breakfast Club. Any kind of club-based film, I feel like you can grow out of that, but not in such a way where it's like, that's behind me now. I remember last time I watched Breakfast Club, I was probably like 32 or 3, and I was watching it with my lady friend at the time, and I remember we were enjoying it. It's a great movie, and it's also obviously looms large in my own childhood nostalgia. But I remember turning to her at one point during a very dramatic scene in The Breakfast Club and being like, you remember when all this kind of shit really mattered? whether you'd had sex yet or not, or whether your friends were popular or not. It's not something that you're supposed to be able to relate to. Same with Fight Club. When I was 22, Fight Club hit theaters, and I saw it no fewer than 4 times, and I couldn't get enough of it. And I still think it's a pretty good movie, not unlike Breakfast Club. But I remember again watching it in my mid to late 30s and just thinking, like, boy, this guy just needs to get a hobby. That's what it sounds like. Or I don't know, maybe a new job. You know what I mean? It's one of those things when you're a kid, you're supposed to be visceral, like, and I still feel that way. Don't get me wrong. It's just that I realize punching my boss isn't going to solve anything, especially because my boss is actually pretty cool. The current one, not most of the former one. Anyway, so yeah, like I was saying last week, Thunderbird was one of the first X-Men to die, if not the first X-Man to die on a mission. They made a big deal about his new costume, and I was kind of rolled my eyes at first, but then in the back it said, we'd like to offer some special thanks to this issue's artist David Cutler as a proud member of the Kalipu Micmac First Nation. I do very sincerely apologize for my very white pronunciation. David's thoughtful redesign for Thunderbird was very much informed Stephen Nyla's work with the character. So, I mean, I don't have a problem with the new costume, although I think this costume is problematic now. The domino masks, for some reason, is a thing. I think Thunderbird looks cool as fuck. That was one of the reasons why he was one of my favorites. But the new costume doesn't look bad. And Warpath still has his similar but not the same costume. So, yeah, it was great. He goes back home. He fights some bad guys. Bad guys harkening back to the 70s, if I'm not mistaken. And I really, really hope he ends up on a team. Or, I don't know if he can carry his own book. This is something, too, that Marvel has done, and I've noticed this more than once, is that I want to make clear, first of all, I'm not one of these white people who fetishizes Native Americans. I find that very uncomfortable. I also think, as I've mentioned, I once dated a Native American lady, and the less said about that, the better. Just putting all my cards on the table here. But they did a Werewolf by Night series not that long ago that was, instead of it being Jack Russell, it was a Native American character. I remember like the really good War Machine title that Greg Pak wrote took place on a reservation a lot, if I remember correctly. They've brought Red Wolf back. I actually just got this issue of Red Wolf recently. This is Red Wolf number 7 of the 9-issue series from the 70s. Could never get this character off the ground, although I love it. The last time they tried to do Red Wolf was during Secret Wars, so that was in 2014. They created there's been like 4 or 5 Red Wolves. So they created a new Red Wolf, and he was in a different timeline, because that was Secret Wars. Was the whole thing was a bunch of different. It was the multiverse. Everybody's losing their minds for now. And then he was brought after Secret Wars. I feel like the character was popular enough. They're like, oh, let's give him his own book. And I don't know if they did exactly. Did they? Yeah, I think they did. I think they eventually gave him his own kind of like, it only went 4 or 5 issues maybe, and then they did David F. Walker wrote a book called Occupy Avengers, which was not long after the Occupy Wall Street protests and stuff, where Hawkeye went out on the road to try to right some wrongs, because of course a white guy's going to solve everything. But he does team up with Red Wolf, and it was good. So I feel like Marvel's really been trying the last couple years to have a Native American character really work. Rebecca Roanhart, that's her name, was writing the Echo Phoenix Song series. And Echo, Maya Lopez, I guess is part Native. I was always under the impression that she was Hispanic, like Puerto Rican or Dominican, because she's from New York, not to be not to stereotype, but that was when that character was first introduced 20 years ago, that was always my giving her name. But I think they have made it that she is part Native. So I hope it worked, but I really hope Thunderbird goes then, if that's what they're really trying to do. If it's not going to be Red Wolf, And I don't think Echo is really. I've always liked that character, but I don't think she's popular enough that you're going to be able to give her own title. But Thunderbird, I really feel like they tried to do it with Werewolf by Night. I think trying to get new readers interested in it, but if you have the X-Men brand on a character, then that should help. Now I'm just wildly speculating, and I leave that up to you. All right, that's all I want to do today. Have a nice day.